Hey, one of the most interesting topics that has been in the news for the last few years is the rise of China as an economic powerhouse, as a global superpower, and as an adversary to America and to the West. And a lot of people don't really know the background information about this particular conflict between China and the West. And if you don't have the proper information, it's easy to assume, based on what you read uh, and see in the media, that China is just this super aggressive country that's hell bent on world domination. You know, a lot of people think that China is simply adversarial for the sake of being adversarial, and that they abuse human rights of other people just for the sake of doing it. And people just pretty much think that China is an evil place. But in reality, you have to go back in the past in order to figure out why China behaves the way that they do and why the West perceives China in the way that they do. First of all, China is a really, really big country. It's the largest country in the world in terms of population. But it always wasn't like that. China wasn't always a unified country known as China. At a certain point in time, after thousands of years of existence, because China is like the second largest civilization after Egypt, and probably one of the longest lasting, if not the longest lasting civilization on Earth. But after their heyday, after thousands of years of being a cohesive, structured civilization and government, they went through a period of time called the Century of Humiliation. And you can Google that and learn more about it. And during that particular time, they lost the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars, to make it simple, is the event that basically caused Great Britain, England, to steal Hong Kong from China. Basically, what happened is opium became a huge problem in China. Opium is an opiate. It's similar to heroin and Percocets and stuff like that. And a lot of farmers in China used to grow it. It was a part of their culture. But at a certain point in time, it got to a point where a lot of the Chinese citizenry became addicted to opium. So China was trying their hardest to intervene and stop their people from becoming opium addicts. Okay? Great Britain needed China because they wanted their tea. Great Britain has always loved tea. It's not just a stereotype. And they used to spend millions of dollars buying tea from China. All right. It got to a point where Great Britain didn't want to pay for that tea anymore. They figured, why should we pay for the tea when we can simply trade opium for it? We know that China has a large population of opium addicts, so what we can do is we can grow opium from India, which Britain had control over, and we can trade that for tea. The problem is China didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that this other country is coming into their sovereign nation and illegally selling their people opium. So China, they've always pretty much had a tight they always had tight control over their trade. You couldn't just pop up in a ship and start trading. You only could go to a certain location to trade stuff, and you had to have all these permits from the government, because China really never trusted outside people. They were always fearful that these Western powers would try to colonize them, because this is the age of time when Africa became subjugated and all these other places in the world became subjugated by European imperialism. So they always had their eye on the European powers because they didn't want them to try to trick them into enslaving them, basically. So in order to trade with China, they had to obey tight rules. So as the need for tea increased, Britain got more and more upset with China because they had these tight rules in order to trade, and on top of that, they didn't want to spend the millions of dollars in order to get the tea. So, what what uh, what Britain did was they illegally smuggled opium into China. They grew it in India and they would smuggle it in illegally. And it got to a point where the Chinese population became so addicted to opium that the government They were constantly finding illegal opium, burning it. They instituted a death penalty for anybody that got caught with it, and it caused a war. China got upset because Britain kept smuggling in opium and causing their people to become addicts. All because Great Britain just wanted some tea. They couldn't obey the rules of trade. They wanted to pretty much go into China and trade wherever they wanted. They didn't want to obey any of the rules and all of that stuff. And they figured, hey, instead of obeying the rules, we could just go to war with them. And if we win the war, we'll have unlimited access to tea. And all we have to do is trade opium for it. So Britain basically wanted to intentionally turn China into addicts. So that's a reason why China in 2021 doesn't trust the Western powers, because they remember that happening. Another thing is, um, a lot of the Western powers actually portioned off pieces of China and had ownership of them. Germany might have ports here. France might have ports here. They actually went into China during a time when China was at its weakest point. There was no centralized government. The country had pretty much fallen apart, and essentially, China wasn't even a country. The northern part of China had its own government, the southern portion had its own government, the eastern portion had its own government, and so on and so on. It wasn't China as one entity. And because they didn't have cohesiveness, it made it easy for these Western powers to come into China and take over various natural resources, raw materials, and essential infrastructure. And also Japan. Japan is China's number one enemy. I mean, Japan used to constantly try to go into China and take over. At one point in time, leading up to World War II, China actually invaded this area. I mean, Japan actually invaded this area of China called Nanking, and the top generals of the Japanese military instituted a game in which the person who cut off the most heads would win a prize. So they had absolutely no respect for the Chinese people. They would roam the streets looking for anybody to cut the heads off of, kids, women, pregnant women, whatever. And, they would take these pictures of them standing on top of these large mountains of heads that they decapitated with their swords. You know, uh, yeah, so China used to have sovereignty over Vietnam, but they lost that to the French. So, I mean, basically, China, it was a country that was so big after its big dynasties and its legendary dynasties lost control of over the country, it became disunified. It wasn't even a country anymore. It was just a big land, and each part was ruled by different warlords, and it just made it very easy for these European Western powers to come into their country and take their stuff. I mean, you got to understand, at this point in time, the European powers were going on a non-ending quest to take over the world. They took over India, they took over Africa, they took over the Middle East. I mean, the entire world was essentially subjugated by the Western powers. So China, of course, they wanted China. China was this huge place. They had a lot of natural resources. There were a lot of people living there that they could use as a labor force. So they had their eye on China, and they wanted China. The Western powers, in addition to Japan, those are the two responsible parties that caused the most damage to China. Especially Japan. I mean, Japan and China have so much beef with each other that they argue right now in 2021 over their history books. Japan doesn't even talk about the atrocities, like I mentioned about the decapitations. They don't mention any of the atrocities that they committed on China throughout the years. They whitewashed it and pretended it never happened, and both countries actually hate each other right now because of that. So now, fast forward to 2021, China's an economic powerhouse. They have a huge economy, they're very powerful. Everybody in the world wants to do business with them, and they remember their history. They remember this period of time when they were weak, They remember the period of time when England tried to literally make their population addicts. They remember the time when they were disunified and the Western powers in Japan tried to come into their country and literally steal all their stuff. And they just don't want that to happen again. So do a little bit more research into it, because I'm not really speaking from a point of fluidity when it comes to these particular issues, because I don't have any research in front of me or anything to read. I'm just going off the top of the head. But please understand that China is not acting the way that they claim they are for no reason. They're acting that way because they have this mentality of never again will we go through the century of humiliation. Look that up. Century of humiliation. Peace.